The dossier didn't arrive by post. It was waiting for me inside my private safe within the penthouse overlooking the Thames. Silas, my information broker, had bypassed 3 layers of biometric security just to prove a point. Nowhere was safe, and no one was loyal. The leather-bound folder contained the autopsy of my relationship with Caleb, a man I was set to marry in 3 weeks. Outside, the London fog pressed against the glass like a suffocating shroud, mirroring the blinding ignorance I had lived in. My family, the Ashcrofts, were royalty in the world of investment banking. We dealt in absolute certainties, yet I had failed to hedge against the volatility of my own blood. I opened the file. The photographs were grainy, taken in the dimly lit corners of exclusive clubs in Mayfair and the backseats of tinted limousines, but the faces were unmistakable. Caleb, the golden boy of the merger department, and Beatrix, my younger sister. Beatrix, who had always played the role of the fragile porcelain doll, was revealed here as something far sharper and more dangerous. The transcripts Silas provided were damning. They weren't just lovers. They were conspirators. They laughed about my rigidity, my obsession with the firm's legacy, while plotting to siphon proprietary algorithms to Lady Sterling, the matriarch of our fiercest competitor. Caleb was the extraction tool. Beatrix was the inside access. They planned to initiate a hostile takeover the moment, I said. I do, using the marriage to bind my assets while they gutted the company from within. My reaction was not sorrow. Sorrow implies loss, and one cannot lose what was never real. Instead, I felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and clarifying. I instructed Silas to let the play continue. I needed them to believe they had won. For the next 20 days, I played the doting fiancé and the supportive sister. I signed checks for Beatrix's artistic endeavors and listened to Caleb's rehearsed vows, all while Silas planted digital tripwires in the files they were stealing. Every document they smuggled to Lady Sterling was now laced with a dormant virus, a poison pill designed to activate only when integrated into her mainframe. But the corporate sabotage was merely business. The personal retribution required a stage. The wedding took place at our ancestral estate in Surrey, a sprawling Gothic manor that reeked of history and damp earth. The guest list was a who's who of the British elite, a perfect audience for a public execution. I walked down the aisle, the silk of my dress rustling like dry leaves, my eyes locking onto Caleb's deceptive smile. Beatrix stood beside me, adjusting my train, her touch burning like ice. The ceremony concluded, and the reception began in the Great Hall. When the time came for speeches, I stepped up to the podium. The room quieted, expecting gratitude. Instead, I signaled the orchestra to stop. We often speak of unions based on trust, I began, my voice echoing off the stone walls. But some unions are based on transactions. I gestured to the massive monitors flanking the room. The screens flared to life, not with romantic montages, but with high-definition video of Caleb and Beatrix finalizing their deal with Lady Sterling's proxy. The audio was crisp, Caleb mocking my father's senility, Beatrix complaining about her allowance while agreeing to sell the client list. The gasps from the audience were audible, a collective intake of shock. Lady Sterling, seated near the front, dropped her crystal flute, the sound of shattering glass punctuating the revelation. I didn't shout. I simply detailed the timeline of their fraud, the amounts stolen, and the inevitable police inquiry that would begin the moment. Silas unlocked the doors. I looked at Beatrix, now pale and trembling, and felt nothing but disdain. I had turned their victory feast into a funeral for their social lives. As the security team moved in to escort the groom and the maid of honor away, I took a sip of vintage red wine, tasting the iron tang of absolute victory. But I knew this was just the opening move. Lady Sterling would not forgive this humiliation, and a wounded predator is always the most dangerous. The morning after the wedding, London did not wake up gently. It was jolted awake by the headlines. "The Red Wedding of Surrey," the tabloids screamed, splashing blurry stills of Beatrix's terrified face and Caleb's humiliation across every newsstand from Kensington to Shoreditch. I sat in my office at Ashcroft Holdings, watching the stock ticker. Paradoxically, our share price had ticked up by 2%. The market, it seemed, appreciated a CEO who cut off Gangrenus's limbs without hesitation. But while the shareholders were impressed, my family was imploding. My parents stormed into my office just before noon. Charles Ashcroft, my father, looked 10 years older than he had yesterday. His reputation, carefully curated over decades of quiet luncheons and discreet philanthropy, had been dragged through the mud. "You didn't just burn the bridge, Veronica," he spat, slamming his cane onto the Persian rug. "You bombed the foundation." Was a quiet annulment not enough? Did you have to broadcast our shame to the world? My mother, Eleanor, wouldn't even look at me. She sat by the window, weeping silently into a lace handkerchief not for me, but for Beatrix. "She's your sister," she whispered. "You've destroyed her." "She destroyed herself," I replied, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I just turned on the lights." I dismissed them with a coldness that frightened even me. I had saved the firm, but I was now entirely alone. Or so I thought. Silas emerged from the server room adjoining my office the moment they left. He looked grim. "Lady Sterling isn't retreating," he said, pulling up a secure feed on the wall monitors. "She's spinning it. She's released a statement claiming the video evidence was a deep fake, generated by a jealous ex-fiancé. She's suing you for defamation, corporate espionage, and emotional distress. It's a smokescreen, of course." "A smokescreen for what?" I asked, pouring myself a glass of water. "For the virus," Silas replied. "The malware we planted in the files Beatrix stole? It executed, but it hit a firewall we didn't see coming. Sterling has a localized backup. She has about 40% of our proprietary trading algorithms. It's not enough to ruin us, but enough to hurt. And she's going to use them." I felt a migraine blooming behind my eyes. This was war, and I was ready for a siege. But I wasn't ready for what happened next. The intercom buzzed. It was my secretary, her voice trembling. "Miss Ashcroft? There are police here. Detective Inspector Thorne. He says it's urgent." I exchanged a glance with Silas. He immediately vanished into the shadows of the back exit. I smoothed my blazer and told them to send him in. D.I. Thorne was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and left out in the rain too long. He wore a cheap trench coat and an expression of permanent fatigue. He didn't sit down. "Ms. Ashcroft," he began, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I'm afraid I have some bad news regarding Mr. Caleb Vance. If he's trying to file a restraining order, tell him he's flattering himself," I said, keeping my tone bored. Thorne didn't smile. "Mr. Vance isn't filing anything, ma'am. His body was pulled out of the Thames near Wapping early this morning. Fishermen found him tangled in a net." The room seemed to tilt. Caleb was a snake, a cheetah, and a thief, but dead? Suicide? I asked, my throat suddenly dry. "Unlikely," Thorne said, stepping closer, his eyes scanning my face for a reaction. "Unless he managed to tie his own hands behind his back and shoot himself twice in the chest before jumping." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "Am I a suspect, Inspector?" I asked finally. Thorne pulled a plastic bag from his pocket. Inside was a damp, waterlogged piece of paper. "We found this in his jacket pocket. It's a printout of an email sent from your private server 2 days ago. It essentially tells him that if he doesn't return the stolen data, he's a dead man. We're going to need you to come down to the station, Miss Ashcroft." As they led me out of my own building in handcuffs, past the flashing cameras of the paparazzi I'd once courted, I realized the terrifying truth. I hadn't just exposed a betrayal. I had walked into a frame-up. Lady Sterling hadn't just stolen my algorithms. She had stolen my freedom. And somewhere out there, the real killer was watching, knowing that the Iron Lady of London finance was about to trade her penthouse for a prison cell. The interrogation room at Scotland Yard was a study in sensory deprivation. The walls were a sterile, headache-inducing white, and the mirror, one way, undoubtedly reflected a version of myself that I barely recognized. My mascara was untouched. my posture rigid but inside. The gears were grinding against the sand of exhaustion. Thorne sat opposite me, playing the part of the weary wolf waiting for the deer to stumble. He pushed the printed email toward me again. It was a masterpiece of forgery. The timestamps aligned perfectly with my login sessions. The IP address traced back to my private server in the penthouse. The text was threatening, concise, and violent. Exactly how a prosecutor would imagine a scorned CEO would write. But it was flawed in one crucial detail. It was emotional. I do not make threats based on anger. I make moves based on logic. The person who wrote this wanted me to sound like a woman scorned, not a strategist. And I knew exactly who that sounded like. My solicitor, a man named Arthur who cost more per hour than Thorne made in a month, finally arrived to cut through the theatrics. He didn't argue innocence. He argued procedure. The warrant was too broad. The chain of custody on the digital evidence was shaky, and my flight risk was non-existent given my public profile. The bail was set at an astronomical figure. Some meant to keep me in a cell, but they underestimated my liquidity. I posted it within the hour. Walking out of the station was worse than being inside. The paparazzi swarmed the exit like flies on a carcass. I pushed through the blinding flashbulbs, ignoring the shouted questions about whether I had pulled the trigger myself. I didn't go home. My penthouse was now a crime scene, swarming with forensics teams, planting more evidence or finding what was already there. I got into the black sedan Arthur had arranged, but instead of the hotel he suggested, I gave the driver coordinates to a derelict shipyard in East London. Silas was waiting for me in a rusted shipping container that he had converted into a Faraday cage, a secure room blocking all electronic signals. He looked worse than I felt. He hadn't slept. He handed me a tablet, his fingers trembling slightly. While I was answering Thorne's repetitive questions, Silas had been digging into the digital ghost of Caleb Vance. Caleb, it turned out, was a coward, and cowards always keep insurance. Hidden within the metadata of the files he stole was a link to a cloud server. Unrelated to Lady Sterling or my company, it was a personal repository. Silas had cracked it open just minutes before I arrived. It contained audio recordings. Caleb hadn't just been sleeping with Beatrix. He had been recording their planning sessions, likely to blackmail her later if she tried to cut him out of the payoff. I put on the headphones. Caleb's voice was shaky, pleading. He was talking about backing out, saying the corporate theft was one thing, but the other plan was too dangerous. Then I heard Beatrix. Her voice wasn't the shrill whine I was used to. It was cold, amused, and terrifyingly calm. She told him that there was no backing out. She spoke of Lady Sterling not as a boss, but as a partner. And then came the revelation that froze the blood in my veins. Beatrix wasn't just selling the algorithms for money. She was trading them for protection. She had racked up gambling debts in Macau that exceeded her trust fund 10 times over. The people she owed were not bankers. They were the triads. Lady Sterling had agreed to cover them debt in exchange for the destruction of Ashcroft Holdings. But the final recording was the smoking gun. It was dated the night of his death. Beatrix was there on the recording. She wasn't just an accomplice. She was the one who lured him to the river under the guise of a getaway. Caleb didn't commit suicide and a random mugger didn't kill him. My own sister had walked him to his execution to silence. The only man who knew the full extent of her leverage. The realization shifted the ground beneath me. I wasn't fighting a corporate rival anymore. I was fighting a desperate animal cornered by international syndicates. Beatrix had framed me not just out of spite, but because she needed a fall guy to close the police investigation quickly. If the police kept digging, they would find the triad connection, and that would get her killed. By pinning it on me, she was trying to save her own life. I looked at Silas. We couldn't go to the police. Thorne was already convinced of my guilt, and this audio file, obtained illegally, would be inadmissible in court. We had to go to the source. We had to find the person Beatrix was reporting to within Sterling's organization. The handler. Silas pulled up a name, Julian Vane. Sterling's head of security. A man known for making problems disappear. We had to get to him before he got to us. Julian Vane didn't operate out of an office. Offices leave paper trails, and Vane was a ghost. Silas tracked him to the Obsidian, an ultra-exclusive Ambis-only club in Soho that masqueraded as a gallery for avant-garde art but functioned as a neutral ground for London's underworld elite. Getting in required more than money. It required leverage. Silas, utilizing a back door into the club's biometric scanner, registered my retinas under a pseudonym, The Widow. It was a grim joke, but fitting. I traded my business suit for a dress that looks like liquid midnight and concealed a small, non-lethal taser in my clutch. I wasn't going there to arrest Vane. I was going there to buy him. Every mercenary has a price, and I had the deepest pockets in the city. The interior of the Obsidian was suffocatingly dark, lit only by strips of neon violet that made the patrons look like corpses. I found Vane in a private booth at the back, flanked by two men who looked like they chewed glass for breakfast. Vane was handsome in a reptilian sort of way, sipping a whiskey that probably cost more than a mid-sized car. He didn't look surprised to see me. In his line of work, paranoia is a survival trait, and he likely knew I was coming the moment I stepped onto the pavement outside. I didn't wait for an invitation. I slid into the booth opposite him, placing the tablet with the encrypted audio files on the table between us. I didn't speak. I simply let the recording of Beatrix implicate him in Caleb's murder. Vane smiled, a slow, predatory curling of the lips. He didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned forward, the scent of expensive cologne and stale tobacco wafting over me. He explained that I had misunderstood the game board. I thought this was about algorithms and stock prices. He told me that was merely the surface current. The Triad, specifically the Red Lotus faction to whom my sister owed her life, didn't care about high-frequency trading. They cared about logistics. Ashcroft Holdings owned shipping routes and container ports in Felixstowe and Southampton. Beatrix had promised them uninspected passage for their merchandise, fentanyl, and human trafficking victims in exchange for clearing her debt. Caleb was killed not because he wanted out, but because he had panicked and threatened to go to the port authorities. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. My family's legacy, built on centuries of maritime trade, was being sold off as a smuggling pipeline for a criminal syndicate, and the linchpin was my own sister. Vane then dropped the final anchor. Lady Sterling wasn't the mastermind. She was just another middleman, a fence for the stolen tech. The real power lay with the Red Lotus. And then Vane's demeanor shifted. He looked at his watch and told me that my time was up. He hadn't killed me yet because I was still useful as the scapegoat for Caleb's death. But now that I knew about the ports, I was a liability. He reached for his jacket, presumably for a weapon, but Silas was faster. The lights in the club suddenly died, plunging the room into absolute pitch blackness. The fire alarm shrieked, a deafening mechanical scream that caused instant panic. In the chaos, I didn't run away from Vane. I jammed the taser into his neck and pulled the trigger. He convulsed and slumped forward. I grabbed his encrypted phone, the key to his communications, with the Triads, and scrambled into the crushing crowd of fleeing patrons. I emerged into the cool night air of Soho, gasping for breath, clutching the device that could either exonerate me or get me killed. Silas pulled up to the curb in a stolen taxi, screaming for me to get in. As we sped away, I looked back to see Vane's men pouring out of the club, scanning the street with lethal intent. I had the evidence, but now I had a target on my back that every hitman in London could see. The hunter had become the prey, and the night was far from over. We didn't go to the police station, with Vane's encrypted phone burning a hole in my pocket and the entirety of London's underworld likely hunting us. The police were too slow, too bureaucratic, and potentially compromised. We went to the source. We drove to the Surrey estate, the place where this nightmare had begun with a wedding that never happened. The storm had followed us south, turning the winding country roads into rivers of mud. Silas drove with the grim determination of a man who knew the odds were fatal, while I sat in the passenger's seat, watching the familiar hedgerows blur past, realizing that I was driving toward the execution of my own sister. Not a physical execution, perhaps, but a total dismantling of her life. She was hiding there, I knew it. It was the only place she felt entitled to, the fortress she believed would protect her from the consequences of her sins. The manor was dark when we arrived, a looming silhouette against the lightning-streaked sky. I told Silas to stay in the car and keep the engine running. This confrontation had to be done alone. I entered through the kitchen, the servants long gone for the night, and made my way to my father's study. Beatrix was there, sitting in his leather chair, a glass of his finest brandy in her hand. She didn't look like a criminal mastermind. She looked small, frightened, and pathetic. But when she saw me, her expression shifted to that familiar, toxic mix of envy and entitlement. She didn't apologize. Instead, she laughed, a brittle, jagged sound. She pulled a small pistol from the desk drawer, a pearl-handled antique my father kept for show. She told me that it didn't have to end this way, that I could have just stepped aside and let her have her share, that I was too greedy to see that she was drowning. I didn't flinch. I held up Vane's phone. I told her that in my hand, I held the entire contact list of the Red Lotus Triad, along with the GPS coordinates of their next shipment and the recordings of her authorizing it. I explained with the calm cadence of a boardroom presentation that I had already forwarded the entire data packet to 3 recipients: Scotland Yard, the port authorities, and, crucially, an anonymous tip line often monitored by the Red Lotus's rivals. Her face crumbled. The gun wavered in her hand. She realized then that I hadn't just come to arrest her. I had come to checkmate her. If she shot me, she would be hunted by the police for murder. If she ran, the triads would find her for exposing their operation. She was trapped in a box of her own making. The sound of sirens cut through the storm, wailing like banshees in the distance. Silas had made the call the moment I stepped inside. Beatrix dropped the gun, the metal clattering loudly on the hardwood floor. She slumped back into the chair, sobbing, not for what she had done to Caleb, or to me, or to our family, but for the loss of the fantasy she had built. I walked over, picked up the gun, and unloaded it, placing the bullets in my pocket. I didn't comfort her. I didn't hug her. I looked at her with the eyes of a stranger. When the police burst through the heavy oak doors, I stepped aside and let them take her. As they cuffed her, she screamed my name, begging for help, begging for her big sister to fix it one last time. I simply turned my back and looked out the window at the rain, washing away the sins of the Ashcroft name. 6 months have passed since that night. The scandal was immense, a firestorm that consumed the tabloids for weeks. But in the world of finance, notoriety is just another form of currency. Ashcroft Holdings is stronger than ever. I purged the board, fired anyone with even a tangential link to Lady Sterling, and tightened our security to military standards. Beatrix is currently awaiting trial in a high-security wing. Her lawyers are pleading insanity, but the evidence is too precise for that to stick. My parents have retreated to a villa in Tuscany, unable to face the society that now whispers behind their backs. I am alone in the penthouse, surrounded by steel, glass, and silence. Sometimes I look at the river where Caleb died, and I feel a phantom pang of regret, but it passes quickly. I learned the hardest lesson of all. In the game of power, family is not a sanctuary. It is a vulnerability. And I no longer have any vulnerabilities. I am the queen of a silent empire, and finally, I can sleep.